They have been killed, on average, at a rate of 52 people a day. There are now 1,001 Palestinians who've died under Israel's 19 days of deadly bombardment. But the end is nowhere in sight. Hamas says there are still differences over the Egyptian ceasefire proposal. An Arab summit in Qatar is 2 days away. Saudi Arabia's now called for another meeting a day earlier. Lots of diplomatic effort, it seems, but almost no concrete action. We'll hear from our teams on the ground in a moment after this report from Mike Hanna.
In Gaza, even the dead do not lie in peace. An Israeli bomb dropped on the Sheikh Radwan cemetery, pulverizing dozens of bodies, some of which had been buried in recent days, and no rest for the living. The quiet between attacks filled with tension and contemplation of an existence that's been ripped apart. This, the stark reality of a war in which unarmed civilians are as much under fire as the fighters. The UN Secretary-General arrived in the region as diplomatic moves to secure a ceasefire continue to no avail. The call made by the Security Council last week still ignored, and Ban Ki-moon reveals he's been in direct contact with the Israeli authorities.
I would not give you any detail what I have been discussing with Israeli government, but you have my full commitment that I will do my best as Secretary General of the United Nations, first and foremost to bring ceasefire immediately and do whatever I can do in my power to bring humanitarian assistance, and also encourage all the negotiations now under discussions.
And while Israel fights in the south, sirens sound in its north. 3 rockets fired across the Lebanese border. No one is killed, no one is injured, and no one has claimed responsibility. The Israeli government still giving no sign of any timetable for its operation. The Prime Minister intent on pressing ahead with the invasion of Gaza. According to media reports, reluctant to call a meeting of his security cabinet in which a timetable may be debated. The Defense Minister sending signals that he's in favor of an initial short-term ceasefire, one which might allow the negotiations for a longer-term agreement to gain some traction. Sources indicate that Ehud Barak may send his representative to attend the talks in Cairo within the next 24 hours. The idea that General Amos Gilad would then brief the Security Cabinet on his return. That is, if the Prime Minister allows it to convene. But meanwhile, the incessant attacks on Gaza continue. The telltale tendrils of white phosphorus lace the sky, a substance that can and does burn to the bone. The flames roar in people's homes, precious water that's in short supply, used in an attempt to contain the damage. More injured, more ferried to the hospitals, and more carried to their graves as the death toll crosses a grim mark. More than 1,000 Palestinians killed in less than 3 weeks of Israeli attack. Yet despite the bloodshed, the destruction, the suffering, the Palestinian rockets still fly. Mike Hanna, Al-Jazeera, Jerusalem.
Let's go live now to our teams on the ground in Gaza. Is Ayman Mohideen in southern Israel? Is Alan Fisher. Alan, I will come to you in a moment. First, Ayman in Gaza. We're getting these lines out from Hamas. Apparently still some problems with the Egyptian ceasefire proposal. Are you hearing anything further?
Well, Kamal, one of the positions we know that Hamas was always concerned about from the very beginning of the discussions about the Egyptian initiative was how to guarantee that the crossings and the siege that has been in place on Gaza and its people for 18 months would be lifted, but not simply just by words. How would it be monitored? How would it be assured that Israel would adhere to the opening of the crossings? That is really the most critical point, it seems, for this ceasefire to be agreed upon. What we do know is that obviously the Egyptian discussion would, or the initiative would require cessation of hostilities, a withdrawal of the Israeli troops from Gaza. I think both sides agree to that. There's no doubt about it. The issue is, how do you ensure that the previous 6-month ceasefire that did take effect, whereby the crossings were supposed to open, Palestinian factions were supposed to fire rockets, how do you avoid the kind of failure that you saw then? One of the points that we have heard from Hamas was perhaps ensuring international monitoring mechanisms on the crossings to somehow allow for international bodies to observe just how consistently those crossings are going to open, but at the same time rejecting the idea of any kind of troop presence in Gaza, foreign troop presence, because in their eyes they would think that would protect Israel more than they would protect the Palestinian people. And that has been the sticking point from senior Hamas officials we've spoken to here in Gaza. The question is, how are they going to agree into a wording of some sort that will allow there to be international observers or international monitoring mechanism at all the crossings to ensure that any ceasefire that Israel adheres to it. That is from the Hamas perspective. From the Israeli perspective, certainly it is concern about how are you going to stop the smuggling into Gaza and the tunnels. Again, the issue about the tunnels requires some kind of international effort. In the past, we've seen that despite the efforts there between the Egyptians and the international community to stop the tunnels, we've seen a proliferation of tunnels reaching more than 1,000 that Israel obviously accuses Hamas of using to smuggle weapons. So that is one of the key issues, and perhaps an insight into why even this stage we are still getting some mixed signals from the various degrees of Hamas throughout the region.
Yeah, two sides to any ceasefire, of course. Let me just check in with Alan Fisher in southern Israel. Alan, remind us of where Israel stands on this ceasefire proposal at the moment as far as sending its people to Cairo to actually discuss it and try to move it forward.
Well, they've always believed that there has been a problem between Hamas and Egypt over the exact wording, just as Eamon was saying. The timetable that the Israelis seem to think will work is that there will be a cessation of violence which will extend beyond the 3 hours that we normally see, perhaps a day or two, and then that will be extended if there is no rocket fire coming from Gaza into southern Israel. Then they start talking about a longer term peace. The troops that are there at the moment on the Israeli side continue to stay there for some timescale not yet sorted out. They then pull back to just beyond the border, and then talks begin about opening up the borders, particularly when there are international monitors or some sort of mechanism to make sure that nothing is smuggled into the country, into Gaza, that can be used as a weapon against Israel. So that's how they see the timetable panning out. But of course, until Hamas agrees with Egypt the exact wording of how that's going to work, the Israelis see no point in going to Cairo to get some sort of halfway house. They want to make sure they've got the wording of the full agreement before they can come back and speak about it in the Security Cabinet. So it really plays into the Israelis' hands for the moment, certainly into the hands of Ehud Olmert, who's not very keen on calling a halt to this operation. The longer there is a problem between Hamas and Egypt, the longer Israel is allowed to push against Hamas on the Gaza Strip.
Let's leave the diplomatic side of things there for a moment. Alan, just if you would update us on levels of activity in the last few hours, indeed over the whole day, this 19th day there on the border.
Well, Bet Hanoun seems to have been one of the main focuses of the attention in the northeast corner of the Israeli forces. Certainly before the humanitarian corridor opened, we saw a number of explosions there, following the pattern the experts tell us are phosphorus bombs, only this time they were being fired by artillery rather than coming from the aircraft that normally patrol the skies above the Gaza Strip. There was a temporary ceasefire, that 3-hour humanitarian corridor where not much happened, and then almost as soon as it was lifted, we started to see more artillery shells raining down on Bet Hanoun and that white carpet of smoke covering large parts of the area. In the last hour or so, we've seen a number of flares and a number of very large fireballs, again from that direction, the Bet Hanoun area. And during the day, we also saw 3 rockets clearly being fired out of the Gaza Strip. Just 3 of 15, we're told, that have hit southern Israel throughout the day. No injuries and no damage reported from them. But it's clear that the Israelis have been concentrating on Bet Hanoun in the northeast corner. But we've also heard loud explosions from other parts of the Gaza Strip. Also heard from Eamon about activities elsewhere. So this isn't just concentrated on one area. This spreads right across